That it? All right, welcome everyone to the Cartographer Office Hours weekly meeting. Remember, the goal of this space is mainly to discuss RFCs, the ideas to keep improving the project, and of course to open up the floor for contributors to ask questions and propose even more ideas. I'm glad to welcome everyone here. Welcome, Scott, who joins us from Tersky, and welcome, Brian. Welcome to the team. I think this is your first meeting. Is that correct? Welcome.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Awesome. Welcome. All right. Yeah, let me share my screen real quick. Okay. Yeah, I'll put in the chat again the link for the agenda notes. Feel free to drop anything you would like to discuss here. All right. I guess I will take notes for today's session unless you have an objection against that. Okay. Cool. All right. Yeah, please record your attendance there. The attendance list. If your affiliation is with VMware, you only need to provide your name. All right. Review outstanding RFCs. So we have the general board here of all the RFCs, but we have a couple that were added here. Yeah, I just saw the PR for this one like 10 minutes ago. So I think it's fairly new. So let me step back. Here's the current list and the status of the RFCs. We don't have anything blocked on TOC. And especially we have a couple of stuff, a couple of RFCs blocked. I believe they block each other. I trying to remember well. So for those who are in review, I don't know if there's any update some of you would like to share. Simplify runnable RFCs.
Simplify runnable is still kind of in the same holding pattern. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. If you look over.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So yeah, there are 10 RFCs in this case. So yeah, well, 9 of them accepted. Some of them in progress. So we have a good list of ideas here already discussed and accepted and ready to be implemented, I believe. Okay, right. So we have the add match parent selector. Seems like most recent change of status was denied. So
yeah, I'm happy to talk to this.
Okay.
The irony is, I feel like I led the charge on saying, "Oh no, we don't need this. We don't need this proposal," and I'd laid out really thinking through our personas as you've got your app operator and your app developer, and the app operator is responsible for supplying, for writing into the supply chain the parameters, like a default parameter or a value parameter. And I argued at the time when this proposal was created, that is sufficient. Like when you make that decision, you then don't need to do any match params because you'll know what the params are, and you can essentially, like, you won't need to delegate to like you may say, like, oh, I'm going to set a default. If you set a default, well, you know what is going to happen unless there's some particular field in the workloads params. And so you can just use match field to figure out what's going on in the workload. Essentially, I was saying there's params are weird because they can come from the template, they can come from the supply chain, they can come from the workload. But if you're writing the supply chain, you will know whether or not you're giving the permission to the workload to alter it. And if you know, like, hey, there's some field on the workload that will matter for execution, then you'll just write your options with match field. And based on that, I think if you read through, everyone is like, yeah, that seems reasonable. Okay, well, this would be extra work. Let's not do that extra work. Since then, we've done some work with Tanzu Application Platform, which uses Cartographer to write supply chains. And one of the things that's become clear to me is there's this other persona that we haven't really been respecting in our discussions, or certainly, and I will take full ownership. Like I hadn't really figured out this extra persona, and that is like this the persona of somebody who's setting up a default platform, but who expects some app operator or some platform operator to come in and tweak it to their needs. And this, I might say another example might be like maybe you're Heroku and you're going to make a modern application platform using Cartographer. And you're going to say like, hey, here are the default supply chains and here's what I think will make sense. But if you want an enterprise account with Heroku, and you want to tweak these supply chains in certain ways, there should be an elegant way for Heroku to say, like, here are my defaults, and an elegant way for them, like elegant controls for them to allow platform operators to change those defaults. And right now, we don't have that. In order to serve that sort of workflow, it's necessary to push a lot of logic into YTT in terms of both creating supply chains and YTT logic in templates, which I think there are a number of folks who agree with me that that's kind of an anti-pattern, that we would we'll know that we've really succeeded when you do not need to push conditional logic into YTT. And so based on that, based on this expectation that there will be a persona who's writing a supply chain that has some defaults, but they don't know at the time that they write the supply chain what the parameters will be that are set in the supply chain, like at runtime. So if I'm if you don't know that, the cleanest way to do that switching is to have match params. So I put this out here to say it was denied. I was definitely I definitely thought it should be denied, and now having yeah, I think we said at the bottom, yeah, this should be with a note. It should be what is it that what's the phrasing that we use? It should be repurposed. It should be brought back to life if yeah. Rash wrote, I vote to move this to declined with the note that it should be reopened should strong user need arise. I'm the user. I've got need. I think that we should add in match params. So yeah, it's been in consideration. I just moved it from declined to, or denied to pending. But if there are no objections, I'd want to move it along in the the next step in the RFC process. I forget what. Yeah, move that to in review, since yeah, I haven't made any changes to this. It would still be looking for the same comments as before.
I'm happy if you say you want it to be in review again, and then we can have a round of folks who have been absent today weigh in.
Sounds good. I'm gonna drag it over. I have this feeling that I'm going to give the same spiel next week. We have some more when we have, for example, any member of the technical oversight committee.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Okay. So no objections, and we need to pending. Yeah. Cool. Anything else regarding this RFC? Otherwise, we'll move to the next one, also proposed by Wishuma.
Yeah. So this came out of a conversation. I could have sworn that it was in office hours. And Sam, maybe you'll be able to help me. We definitely had a meeting with Stephen and Scott about input-output correlation. And like at that meeting, Stephen was like, yeah, maybe we should separate out the two different flows that are currently in the input-output RFC. One that, the one that's doing the input-output, and where it's all in the status, and then the other that's doing this, the flow that's more similar to the superworld proposal about
the observed generation thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the desire there is that because they're seen as two different mechanisms as well, at least in how they behave, that they wanted at least for us to write two separate RFCs so that we could make sure that there's a good focus on the actual changes that are going in for each of those. Because I think there's been a lack of focus when trying to write about this stuff, because it's just very hard, because you want to try and absorb more of the problem space around like being able to trace and being able to be certain of state and things like that. But that's my basic recollection of that meeting anyway.
And do you remember? Do you know if we have any artifacts from that convo? I couldn't find any. So if you know of any, yeah, we should like get that into someplace.
There's a Miro board. Yeah, I can find it.
Yeah, cool. This is, so at the end of that conversation, I had pointed out that with input-output correlation, one of the things that we're doing is we're saying like, hey, there's, we're thinking, for example, like, oh, KPAC will hopefully say there's some fields from our spec, which are the inputs, that will mark in the output, right? That when you get your most recent good image, that KPAC will tag that with like, oh, here's the source URL that came from. And at the end of that conversation, I was thinking about it, and I was like, wait, like if I'm the KPAC author, if I handle that CRD, for me, I'd be like, wait, but why am I prioritizing that one field in the spec when any field, presumably, that you alter in a spec will alter the behavior of the object, and so are meaningful for the outputs on the object. And what I think would be more reasonable for those resource authors to do is instead of trying to guess like, oh, which inputs are other people going to be varying and care about as as like correlating their outputs to, it would be far more reasonable for those individuals to report an observed generation on their output. Now, this is separate from the observed generation that we normally see at the top of the status. Instead, an observed generation that's more similar to the observed generation in meta v1 conditions, which says like, if we look in meta v1 conditions, it says like, hey, here's there's an additional observed generation, and that observed generation is meant to say, here's the generation that led to the current condition that the current status of this condition that's being reported right now. And so we can imagine resource authors applying that same pattern to outputs and reporting for each output, or reporting for their set of outputs. Here's the observed generation that led to this set of outputs. So yeah, so this is, I'll admit that I'm only like, I've got the motivation written into this RFC so far, and it's essentially what I was just talking about. But I have not, there's still like implementation details that I need to write in. But the intention is for this to be a third way that you could specify, because ultimately, whether or not you could use the inputs outputs correlation, whether you can use generation outputs correlation, depends entirely on choices that are beyond us, choices that what do those third-party resources, how do they report and solve this problem? So, yeah, so I wanted to give a heads up that that space is going to get a little more complicated, but hopefully, as you said, break it out into its own separate thing will hopefully make it easy to compartmentalize like each of those conversations.
I have a quick question on that. With input-output correlation, could this also help with correlation of inputs resulting in an error?
Sam, you should feel free to take this one. Right now, there isn't an expectation that you would use that. Certainly you would be able. No, I think, what would you see? So my best guess is what you're saying is like, hey, let's assume that I submitted four different statuses, or four different definitions of an object, and 1 and 2 were good, and then 3 and 4 were bad, and I want to know, or 3 was bad and 4 is still spinning. Currently what it will do is it will let you tell like, hey, there's an output, and that output is the output for number 2. You would see that 2 was good and had an output, and otherwise you would see that it's currently spinning. But I don't think that anything about what's currently proposed would let you understand that 3 was bad at a glance. Because the object, you would expect the object to be in an unknown state. Since 4 is unknown, 4 is still spinning. So yeah, I have 2 questions. One, is the scenario that I put forward, does it reasonably correspond to what you're asking about? And yeah, let me start with that.
Yes, absolutely. So basically, when I see the word correlation, I'm wanting to correlate success, which I think I can do fairly naturally with this proposal. But I also want to correlate failure because that may help me trace to what the cause of failure was. What thing did I say to go executed and was in a bad status? And maybe it's not spinning anymore. Maybe it's just in a defunct status. And it can't get past that defunct status. Because one of the things that I personally have struggled with is being able to triage. And I'm not saying Cartographer should help me triage, but at a glance, if it would give me some sort of hint where to go look, that is always an added bonus. But I'm not sure if that's necessarily the intent here with this RFC.
Yeah, it's largely come from from perspective of being able to trace artifacts that are actually carried on to the next step. But that's not to say that we couldn't also consider this other facet, but I don't think it's been a design goal. I don't think anyone specifically called it out until now, Brian. So I think it's good that you mentioned it. It's definitely something we want to perhaps ask up to the technical oversight committee as well.
Yeah.
Because we may not have an audience currently that depends on input output correlation, but we may have a huge audience that has a desire for input error correlation. Would the implementation look similar or would they look grossly different is also a question I have floating around in my head.
So I think that we could very likely leverage the same sort of syntax for the end user. Like that seems very reasonable to me. But I think that what we would end up with reporting out to the end user would probably look very different because it's a very different problem. I guess,
I'm just trying to think about what diagnosis looks like today, right? And I think it's still very early days, people, but it looks a lot like, you're looking at the individual stage. And we haven't seen, and that's not to say that it's not going to come, these users having these massive problems of like, oh, I've got this error at this stage at this stage C, and I now need to trace all the way back to like the A that caused it. I'm sure it will come, but it's, I guess it hasn't been a problem today.
and it's much more difficult to reason about. Yeah. So it's difficult to reason about what led to this failure because there's all sorts of combinations of, like, the easy case, right, is run n or input n was submitted, the definition was submitted, and the controller spun, and then things it finished, and the output was good. Let's say, like, success equals true, ready equals true, and then definition 2 comes along, and definition 2 fails. It's like, okay, that's easy to reason about. It may not yet be easy to write a controller for, but it's easy to reason about. But then let's say that you let's complicate that. Let's say you submit definition n, and you submit n plus 1 and n plus 2 before n finishes, and then you eventually see. So one, I would expect that I don't think that there's anything stronger than convention in Kubernetes about how those 3 different objects will be reported on. I would expect by convention that I would see that the conditions would remain in an unknown state. Ready would be unknown until that final definition had finished reconciling, and it would either Yeah, and then it would either be in a good or a bad state. And so if it's in a good state, I wouldn't know anything about whether definition 1 or 2 had been bad. And 2, if it was in an error state, similarly, I wouldn't know anything about 1 or 2 if either of those had been bad. So that seems to I think that's hard because I don't think it's a cartographer doesn't yet read that information that's like easy to reason about from the objects. I think it's much more the model of Kate's objects doesn't lend itself to that sort of reasoning.
Right, because as you were talking, I was thinking about if I had a deployment, just a really generic deployment. Cartographer's not submitting deployment directly. In the cases that I've seen, it's submitting something to KApp, and then KApp is reconciling and making the deployment a reality. So if the deployment is crash looping for whatever reason, bad image, bad app, bad config, whatever. But from a KApp perspective, it's kind of in an unknown state, but but Cartographer did what it was supposed to do and submitted it to KApp controller. So the question I would come back to is, should Cartographer know that the thing it submitted to that then did a thing, should it even know? Like, it's confusing to me that it would know what the route was to that thing, for instance, like as an output. And I don't know if that's an output that would be something that I would know about, but let's say it did, but it doesn't know that it's crashing. So I've seen some inconsistency where it would know certain things in these kinds of situations, but in other cases, it doesn't know anything. It's just like, well, I submitted it and it was ready at some point. It's fine, right? Mm-hmm. So in your examples, the process of reconciling makes it really hard too, because like N2 and N3 were bad. They came by and came through so fast that by the time we got to N4, everything was fine. Whatever the reason for that might have been, we don't really care because we're in a healthy state now. We don't really care how we got there. And I agree with that. I think my bigger concern is I'm broken and no number of revisions have gotten me healthy yet. And I was healthy at one point in time, and maybe there is a revision out there that is healthy and running fine, but revisions 2 through 4 are completely unhealthy of whatever it was that I submitted an object to. Should Cartographer know that? Or is it just happy with the fact that, hey, I did have something in the past that was healthy and good and ready. I don't really care about the things that haven't been ready yet. Again, the new version, I don't know. Because when I hear the word correlation, that's just where my brain starts to go, is like, what is that definition? What am I correlating, I guess? And how broad, because that word can be very broad. And I'm sorry to,
So
it's very semantic.
so small bit of history. So we originally were tasked with writing an RFC about supporting artifact tracing through a supply chain, basically being able to say that the output that's been produced from a given stage is indeed the output that was produced based on the inputs that Cartographer used to stamp out that resource in the first place. And so input output correlations kind of just been called out as the subtask of being able to make that assumption just about one resource in the supply chain. The reasoning being that once you can do that for one resource, then you should be able to do it for the entire chain by saying, okay, if I want to make the assertion from one end here, I can just follow all the successive things that came before it. And as long as I have input, output, or correlations for all of those things, I can tie it all the way back to every possible input that went into like this thing that we've got at the end.
So in the case of artifact tracing, because that's the one that I'm really excited about, what if the artifact just failed to at some point in the process? How are we going to trace that?
I mean, you can certainly see. So one thing that's easy to reason about is once you know that generations 1 through n succeeded, and then you have some inputs that never led to outputs. You can say like, oh well, something happened after generation n. Part of the challenge that I was pointing out is if you're submitting very quickly, there's undefined behavior or behavior that we can't know ahead of time for an arbitrary resource how they're going to handle submitting. Like if I submit two, let me put it this way: if I submit 3 definitions very quickly to KPAC, 3 different definitions of the same object with pointing to different commits in source code, KPAC will build the first one, and then it'll see like, oh, I've got 2 new commits, and it will skip the second one entirely, and it'll build the third. So at that point, it's like, well, if 1 was good and 3 was bad, I can't tell if the problem was introduced in commit 2 or commit 3. No, I can tell like, oh, it obviously happened after commit 1. And I think that sort of, this does help us in saying like, well, at least we can say things were, the last time things were good was input n, and everything after n is suspect. But I don't think that it helps us narrow down saying, oh, there are a bunch of candidates after n, and like, I think that might be unknowable from Cartographer's point of view, other than, as you were kind of pointing out, other than teaching Cartographer a lot about the internal operation of different objects. So one thing that I've talked to James about is like, we could have sidecar objects that were like, oh, when you submit a KPAC image, I'll tell you what's going on there. Like every KPAC image is going to create some build objects, and those build objects, they work in this way. And like we could create a catalog of such objects, and then say like, hey, if you submit this object to the cluster, then that information could be leveraged by a Cartographer controller to like do some work. But that would be I think that would be a heavy lift both for us in terms of implementation and then users in terms of creating those sidecar objects.
I wonder if Wishuma something like, I think Cap Controller does this with different config changes down the road, that it creates config maps with data based off of a specific version. And then it has garbage collection of those config maps. I think that the status becomes very difficult when we have multiple versions of things, because you can't show this was version 2, this was version 3, this was version 4. But if we stamped out resources that were garbage collected, let's say the default was 5 last revisions, whatever, of a stamped out resource, got a config map that was created or whatever with the data, because the status is already huge, right? The status of a workload today is very big. And as we add more things, you start to get to the maximum size of an object in etcd, and you start to get to fun things possibly. I don't know how close we are to that. But I think that having that allows then traceability of, on the workload status, we show the current status or what currently Cartographer knows about, but we can print out to config maps other data, which allows also some more free ways of throwing error messages into there from whatever controller, spit that out from KPAC, Cap Controller, whatever it is. Cap Controller, in the end, you get see useful error message. Awesome, like thanks, status useful error message. But that is something that could be very possibly thrown into the config map that was correlated based off of input output.
Yeah, so that question of like, how do we, like, where will we, once we've figured out this correlation, where do we store it is an open question right now. First, we've just been trying to figure out, okay, how can we make this stuff knowable? And then there's the question of how can we make it easily available to folks to read? I'm it sounds like you've got a soft vote for let's not, maybe don't increase the workload status, maybe use a third part. My impression is that we've got kind of three options. We can create new objects in the cluster and count on etcd for perpetuating them. So it's like the config maps. We can put it into the workload status, which seems like the safest. But as you said, like the workload status is limited to 1 megabyte of data. And three, we could like create some internal or external database to the cluster and like give Carto the creds to that, and then we could just write whatever we wanted to that database. I would say that right now my go-to is like workload status until we like I would be shocked if our workload status, even as long like I'm more concerned about readability on the workload status, which I think the boat may have sailed on, than size limits, because I think of a megabyte as like really large for text. But I'm curious what other folks think about those choices, and do you think that there's a fourth option that I've missed?
I definitely, I don't see any other options really other than those. And the only one that I'm not a fan of is a database external, because it just becomes dependent on more resources or more things. I think config maps are something that exist, and if that can be used, if it needs to go to something external and can't be in the status, right? Let's say that it's not in the status. I think config maps becomes the next logical thing, because it's still in etcd. It's something that we can still reason about within the Kubernetes API without creating some external source with some other client to start querying that database. And we can still use the Kubernetes API for everything, including the debugging. I think this is also kind of related to the RFC. We talked about at KubeCon a bit, on like when a Knative service, let's say, would be deployed from Cartographer, how you get some data out of something that was stamped out from something that was stamped out from Cartographer. A Cartographer prints out an app that deploys a Knative service, and I want to get the URL from that, let's say. That came up in the world of deliverables when we were talking about that, I think. But it's that same idea of how do we get the chain of events into Cartographer, and I think can kind of correlate between these two use cases. One is for using within a supply chain, and the other is to, I guess, trace where an error happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are always more RFCs to write.
I mean, we've definitely thought very attractively about rendering out intermediate resources as actual case resources, but there's still a GC question there, and it's definitely going to be like a little more sophisticated than like last 5 good ones, because you don't want to have a successful one and then like have a series of failing ones kind of push it out over the edge. And but yeah, I think I'm also leaning towards it has to be something we're storing in etcd.
I have one more question. So I wanted to say, I agree, storage is tough. I was going to say, well, maybe if you didn't want a database, you could do object storage, but that's still an external dependency, right? And then I've seen other systems use like a Redis, but that's still an external dependency. And the nice thing is right now, Cartographer seems fairly well self-contained to just utilizing K8's APIs, which is a nice continued goal because it eases deployment. I guess maybe to turn this RFC on its head a little bit, would there be a desire for, is there other consumers of that information like some sort of, I don't know if it was in this RFC, but there wasn't an RFC that talked about like a visualizer where you wanted to be able to visualize this information in some form or fashion, either through the Kate's CLI, kube CTL, and then get the workload, what Scott mentioned, or something more extravagant like a user interface. Would those kinds of interfaces require better payloads? And by better payloads, maybe more, because what I want to have is a pointer where it's like, well, go look at this thing over here if you want to know the information. I don't want to have to copy all the information, all the status information. I'd rather say, well, I was looking here when I determined this thing was ready. Go get more details from over here and kind of link to it. That's assuming that I can link to revisions of the thing that I'm pointing to, right? But if I can't do that, then I feel like I'm feeling this need to have history myself and hold on to the history of these statuses, which I think is where we're seeing this desire to, okay, should we put it in a config map, or where should we put it? Because we're observing it at this point in time. And I think at least my fear is losing track of, well, at one point in time, we saw everything was ready, but maybe not everything's ready now, or whatever happened. You have this concern about time, right? Because these are async systems that will converge over time. And my observation at this current point in time, maybe everything's still spinning, but if I come back in 5 minutes, everything's cool. And I don't know. I'm wondering, like, if there's a stakeholder in this data, is that primary persona a user? Is that user a developer? Is that user an operator? Is that user a user interface that's then being presented to a user? Because that might change our theories that a config map would be too limiting in terms of a storage location or not. Because text is large, and I looked it up. A config map's 1 meg as well. So statuses can't exceed a meg. Config maps can't exceed a meg. A meg's quite large when it comes to this text information. I mean, that's a lot of information. So it seems like it'd be okay because it's at a very micro level. It's not like it's everything. It's just the observation of that specific step, right?
Yeah, but right now we got like one for every resource. And so we need to potentially have multiple of those, right? If we want to track,
right.
Maybe there's a successful one, there's one that's still spinning. And then we've got all the conditions on those things also, so there's stuff being copied up. I mean, yes, it makes a lot. I'm not sure we've been doing the science to know how quickly we're approaching it.
It would be very disappointing if you already are approaching it and you don't know.
I concur.
But I think it's less than a minute to scroll up. I don't think we're getting close. Even on large supply chains, it takes only about 30 seconds to scroll up in the terminal to get to the top. So I'd say it's probably not close to a meg yet, but yeah. I could imagine with large supply chains, if we start to add revisions into the status, that you could relatively pretty quickly reach there if you have security steps in your supply chain and you have, let's say, multiple build steps happening and you have a bunch of different, let's say, tasks going along. And when you start to get above 10, 15 steps in your supply chain, if we start to keep revisions, and some controllers throw very, 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 very large error messages and like to just throw random text into there. And it can get a bit large if the user also isn't smart with mapping out what that error message is in the like conditions of what's successful or not and what to print out as the error message. It could get large if we start to add multiple versions.
I think an interesting thing I heard from what Brian was saying just now too is that we could be taking too narrow a view if artifact tracing is just the thing that we're trying to solve. It could be we get all of that data and I don't know, let's say we end up storing everything in etcd, then what happens when we face the, oh yeah, let's go and do GC, but then, I don't know, customers find these resources and go, oh yeah, we'd like to process it this way or do this kind of like time-based analysis on it. Yeah, will we be digging a slippery slope for ourselves?
So one, Sam, I cannot respond to what you just said because I was like trying to find a document and I can't listen and do other things. I'm terrible at it. So my apologies. But I did want to point out kind of two things from what Brian had been saying before. One, I think a lot of the questions that we've been talking about revolve around what's so far, I think the farthest we've gotten in terms of like writing down an approach is this pull request PR 519 that was workload reports artifact provenance. And this is written assuming that the problem of I submitted some input to an object. I submitted an object definition. I got back some object status, and like I know that these two connect. Assuming that problem has been solved, this is the farthest I think we've gotten in terms of writing down an approach to then cache that somewhere. So take a look. I wrote at the beginning of the year. I honestly couldn't tell you right off the top of my head exactly what it says without skimming it. And then Brian, you were asking about do we have a hypothesis of who or what is going to consume this? I think the answer to that is yes. In my head, I'm thinking primarily about developers who are going to create a UI around whatever solutions we come up with here. So, primarily I'm thinking somebody's going to create an app platform using Cartographer, and then that app platform, they'll create a UI that will visualize, hey, you had commit XYZ, click here, and you can see which steps commit XYZ reached.
That makes a lot of sense. For sure.
I think that, yeah, there'll certainly be more about this RC because, as I said, it's like half written, so there'll be details that could be hashed.
Actually, that line you had right there from Evan is kind of what I was referencing. I have not actually gone through this whole RFC yet. I'm catching up, but he made a comment about a reference of some sort. So instead of copying everything over, referencing a revision, but not all do all. Well, okay. I don't believe all CRDs that we could be submitting things to would have revisions, though, right? So
every object in Kubernetes has a generation, but the status may not report an observed generation, and that when you report an observed generation, it's like wonky. Like you could just be reporting like KPAC reports an observed generation N, and then it reports like a latest good image, and that latest good image is of either N or some generation prior to N. So it's a little wonky. If that makes sense.
But there's also no way if you did just a reference of, let's say, the version of a KPAC image to then go and look at that object in an older generation. So by not adding it into the status or some other object that we hold in that Cartographer generates or data that it holds, there's no way for you to then debug necessarily what that resource looked like, which is why it looks like here it's being added in almost as the YAML of that object, or at least the GVK in certain cases is being added in here, because there's no way of knowing what that actually looked like in generation 2 if I'm on generation 4 right now. Right, unless it's something like KPAC, which has a build that gets generated for every generation. Or not every generation if you split too much at a time, and then it skips a version.
Yeah. Yeah, and then of course,
Right, and then there's
as of
no
right now,
data for
that's totally
Cartographer,
opaque
so
to
exactly
to Cartographer.
right.
In a perfect world, you'd have also know when you say opaque, an opaque identifier. To that point, like you've all said, like it's not going to be. You're going to be safer because of the limitations of all of the CRDs you just talked about, KPAC, CAP, and I'll throw even Knative in there, but CAP is what normally interfaces with it. In some cases that I've seen, they don't all work the same. So you have to copy everything.
Yeah, and for many of our objects, that's not a problem. But for the objects that are passing Kate's configuration, that's huge. For like sources, it's like, oh, we just need to copy a URL and a revision,
Right.
Easy peasy. But like image, we just have to copy some URI of an image, easy. But yeah, the Kate's config gets huge.
Or like an inline task run of Tecton. When you create a task run without a reference task and it's just an inline task, like it's done in many supply chains, it can become very long.
Well, that's a long definition, but I would argue that that what needs to be cached is really only the output of whatever that task run is.
Okay. Yeah. Which should be relatively small.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really the config template that would be the long one.
Yeah. Maybe arbitrarily large. But that was why I think in here we there was something about where we said that we were going to truncate some fields. I might be, like I said, I would need to. I can't discuss that RFC very well because I've not read it recently. But also, we're at 2:55. I don't know if there was anything else, David, that you want to discuss.
No, not from me. I was about to remind if we are only 5 minutes left. But this is a great conversation. Thank you all for your insight. Yeah, we don't have anything else in the agenda so far, so you still have 5 minutes for this if you need it.
Maybe let's end 5 minutes early. Let anyone who has another meeting get a drink of water and take a break before they go to it.
Yeah. Yeah, so reminder to everyone here to add your comments to the RFC, to the PR, so everyone out there can add to the conversation, to the discussion, right? Okay, anything else you would like to discuss here briefly? Any other question? Nope. Okay, that was a great discussion. Thank you for your time and hope to see you next week.
See you guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.